I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'm Larry Horton, a member of the Stanford Historical Society's Program Committee and moderator this afternoon. George Shultz was a well-known American statesman of the highest caliber. But that well-known story is not what we're going to focus on today. This program is entitled George Shultz, Citizen of Stanford. Two highly qualified speakers are going to tell us about the contributions George Shultz made to intellectual, academic, and community life at Stanford University. Our first speaker will be Philip Taubman, currently a lecturer in CSAC, the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. Before joining CSAC, Phil had a distinguished 30-year career at the New York Times. He started as a reporter in the Washington Bureau, covering national security, intelligence, and diplomatic issues. He rose to become the New York Times bureau chief in Moscow, deputy editor of the editorial page, bureau chief in Washington, and associate editor of the Times. Phil's career at the New York Times covered the years of George Shultz's service as Secretary of State. Phil traveled as a reporter with George Shultz to trips on Asia, for example, and Phil was bureau chief in Moscow when George Shultz and Ronald Reagan were negotiating with Mikhail Gorbachev to end the Cold War. Phil also has deep Stanford roots. He was editor of the Stanford Daily in his junior year. He married another Stanford Daily editor, and they have a son who has two Stanford degrees and is now an award-winning teacher in New Jersey. Phil also served a 5-year term on the Stanford Board of Trustees. Our second speaker, John Taylor, is the George Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution and the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford. Both George Shultz and John Taylor were successful academicians and both served in high positions in presidential administrations. George's career is well known. John, too, served in senior levels of government. He worked as an analyst and advisor on economic policy under 4 presidents. He was a member of the President's Council on Economic Advisors under George H.W. Bush, and he served for 4 years as Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs under George W. Bush. John is a popular and award-winning teacher of basic economics, Econ 1, to undergraduates here at Stanford. The course is so popular that John has taught it online to students all over the world. He also teaches monetary policy to graduate students. John is a prolific author. He is particularly well known as the author of the Taylor Rule on monetary policy. Whenever the Federal Reserve is considering raising or lowering the interest rate, newspapers and broadcasters are awash with references to the Taylor Rule. He may even tell you about the Taylor Rule in the reception if you want to ask him. George Shultz and John Taylor were colleagues and friends and had great personal regard for one another. They both lived in the faculty housing area at Stanford within walking distance of each other. I think we're in for a real treat to have two speakers who knew George Shultz in such different but very important ways. Phil Taubman will be our first speaker. He will be followed by John Taylor. After the remarks, there will be a question and answer period. Phil?
Thank you, Larry. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to celebrate the life of George Shultz, and in particular today to look at his involvement with Stanford over the decades. He was deeply involved with the university in so many respects, and I think it's really not that widely known So what I've tried to do is pull together a list of occasions over the years where you see George connecting at Stanford in one way or another. And I hope by the time I'm done, you'll get a sense of the richness of his engagement with the university. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these occasions, but you'll see some photographs that go with them, and I'll give you a flavor for his citizenship at Stanford. So the first photo coincides with his first visit to Stanford. The year was 1968. He was dean of the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago, and he decided to take a sabbatical and come out to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Some of you have been at the campus of Caspis. It's up in the hills overlooking the campus and the bay. It's a beautiful site. And in this photo, circled, you'll see George among the fellows in 1968. And when he arrived, the director at the time took him to his office. The offices there are quite Spartan, and showed him his office, and George looks around and he says, "But wait a minute, there's no telephone here." And the director says, "That's right. There's only one telephone at Caspis. It's in my office. You're welcome to use it any time." And George said, "But I'm on the phone a lot. How am I going to work?" And the director said, "You'll get used to it and you'll like it." So fast forward, he becomes Secretary of State. Almost every day during his tenure as Secretary of State, he tried to go into the private office of the secretary, close the door, read, think about what he was trying to do as Secretary of State. There was a telephone in there, but the instructions that he gave to his assistant were put through calls for only two people, the President of the United States and my wife. So while he was here at Caspis, he served as an advisor to Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign. And when Nixon was elected, he invited George to become Secretary of Labor. And here you see George taking the oath of office as Secretary of Labor. And there's a fun little story that goes with that, which says so much about George. When he announced the top officials that were going to serve with him in the Labor Department at a news conference, he worked his way down the list of about 10 people, and all of them were either Democrats or independents. There wasn't a single Republican. And so Nixon's White House aides were livid at that, but that tells you a lot about George. Okay, so 1974. The Nixon presidency is ending in going down in flames because of Watergate. George has become Treasury Secretary. He had 3 jobs in the Nixon administration: Labor Secretary, Director of OMB, Treasury Secretary. He leaves a few months before Nixon resigns and comes back to Stanford. He had fallen in love with Northern California in 1968. He bought a house on campus, and the address is 776 Dolores Street. Many of you probably know it. It's very near Hoover House on campus. And so that was his home here, really, for the rest of his life. While he was here in 1974, Governor Ronald Reagan invited him to Sacramento. He wanted to talk to George about the federal budget and about the federal government. It was his first interaction with Ronald Reagan. That was 1974. Okay, fast forward now. George, while he's here, by the way, becomes a professor at Stanford Business School. He also, his mostly full-time job was serving as a senior executive at the Bechtel Company. Fast forward now to 1980. Ronald Reagan is now running for governor of California, and he has asked George Shultz to head up an economic policy advisory group. And George does that. Reagan becomes president. He's sworn in, He thought about inviting Shultz to become Secretary of the Treasury again, or Secretary of State. Didn't happen. Alexander Haig became Secretary of State, and then a year later, George goes to Washington as Secretary of State in 1982. He's living on Dolores Street at Stanford, and suddenly, now he has the escort of the Secret Service or the Treasury Department police. Secret Service is part of the Treasury Department at that point. California Highway Patrol. Now, suddenly, major government official living on the Stanford campus. He becomes Secretary of State in 1982 with all of this security. While he's Secretary of State, on June 12th, 1983, he gives the commencement address at Stanford. He declared that day that, quote, "the unprecedented expansion of Soviet power over the past 2 decades cannot be ignored or rationalized away." Fast forward again, January 20th, 1989. No longer Secretary of State, the Reagan administration ends. Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, comes to Stanford to meet with George and to George's newfound great friend here, Sidney Drell, the physicist. Drell had become very close to Sakharov remotely. Sakharov had been sent into exile in the city of Gorky by the communist leaders of the Soviet Union because he dissented against their policies. He came here to Stanford. That was a memorable day, I think, for people at Stanford when Andrei Sakharov came here. When George retired, he began a 30-year career at Stanford of convening symposia, conferences, bringing important people here to talk about important issues. And beginning in 1989, it's hard to believe, he authored or co-authored over a dozen books over the subsequent decades, several of them with John Taylor, who's here and will tell you about them. So while George is here now in retirement from being Secretary of State, he is a man in constant motion. His energy never flagged. It was really only until his 98th or 99th year that I, as someone who could see him over the years, could see his energy beginning to flag. In 1991, he convened a meeting of his buddies. Okay, who are his buddies? People like Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Helmut Schmidt, the Chancellor of West Germany. He convenes his buddies into an advisory group for what was known at the time as Stanford's Institute for International Studies, later renamed the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. So there's George contributing in a really critical way to the development of this institute at Stanford. Now we get to George, the Stanford fan. Here he is in his Stanford cap at a football game on September 13th, 2004, in which he served as honorary captain of the Stanford football team. And I had the privilege over the recent decades to go to a lot of Stanford games and sit up in the press box with various Stanford leaders. I can tell you, George was there for every home game. It was amazing. And he really rooted for Stanford football. So I just love this photo where he's in the press box. Some of you may recognize some of the people there. I believe the John and Cynthia Gunn, Steve and Roberta Denning. It's hard to see on this little picture I have. Anyway, you can recognize a lot of the people there. Okay, October 2006, George has this important idea. It's the 20th anniversary of the Gorbachev-Reagan summit meeting at Reykjavik. That was the summit meeting at which they talked seriously, briefly, for a few fleeting minutes about abolishing nuclear weapons. Truly, abolishing nuclear weapons. It didn't happen, but that meeting was a pivotal turning point in the Cold War, leading to an agreement to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear missiles. 20 years later, George said, we've got to pick up the ball from that meeting and run with it. And so he got Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Bill Perry, and his good friend Sid Drell together, and they started momentum again to eliminate nuclear weapons. It produced a stunning piece in the Wall Street Journal that was signed by 4 of them. I remember reading that piece and it took away my breath. Here were 4 giants of the Cold War period, Republicans and Democrats, advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And you can see there they are in the photo. There's George with Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Sid Drell. On May 11th, 2009, George delivered the annual Harry's Last Lecture at Stanford. This is an annual lecture, and let's play a few minutes of what he said that day.
And I'm enjoying spending all day with Stanford students, answering questions, telling stories. But when you're on the spot in front of all these bright kids for all day long, you know it's tiring. They're sensational. Well, I thought to myself, what could I talk about in a lecture like this? And I remembered the business school students asked me to give a last lecture once, and I talked about how to succeed in negotiations. And I thought, well, that's not good for this. Got to do better. And then I dug around, and I found this quotation from one of Harry's last lectures. He asked all of us as enlightened adults to see things as they are, the is. At the same time, we strive to overcome the shackles of ego in order to be loyal instead to a much larger vision of ultimacy and wholeness, the ought. So I thought I would entitle my talk, The Power of the Ought. The idea that you have a vision out there, a place you should go, and how powerful that is in getting you there.
So that's quintessential George Shultz, the ought. I mean, that really captures him, the essence of George Shultz. He was also a great entertainer. Those of you who knew Charlotte as well knew that she loved to throw a party. No one threw a bigger, more extravagant party than Charlotte. George loved these parties. I was fortunate, John was as well, to get invited to some of them. And they were fabulous festive occasions at the house on Dolores Street. I'll always remember the fantastic entertainment up there that went on, including one time they got a group of women in the swimming pool while the cocktail party was going on. They were doing synchronized swimming. This was Charlotte, you know, it was just fabulous. George went to work every day. Long into his 90s, he got into his all-electric Nissan Leaf, drove down to the Hoover Institution, and went to work and spent a lot of time in one of the great rooms at Stanford, which is intact. I urge you to go see it if you can make the arrangements. It should be possible. It's his conference room. So let's let George give you a short tour.
This is the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and below it is a picture of my wife and I and our 5 great-grandchildren. A hug from a great-granddaughter is a pretty good hug. The room we're sitting in is one I use for meetings, and also I can sequester myself here and write. And I've written quite a few books here. And gradually, pictures and other artifacts have been hung up around the walls, so they're pretty full now. This is me with President Reagan at his ranch. I came back from a meeting and gave him a report. That's a castle in Ireland in the background. Here, the President and I meeting with Deng Xiaoping. We're both laughing at something. And this is a meeting in Reykjavik. It was the most important summit meeting ever held. I'm sitting next to President Reagan. Shevardnadze's sitting next to Gorbachev. We were there for 2 full days. It was extraordinary. And here's something I'm proud of. I flew in an F-15. I got in, the pilot's in the front, I'm in the back. We shoot through the sound barrier. My G-suit swells up so blood doesn't rush. We get up and he says, take over. I'd never flown. So I start doing, and it was amazing. And this is again a shot with Gorbachev. He visited here, and we had a big celebration, and he gave a talk in Memod, and Don Kennedy and I, Don was president at the time, we found this in the Hoover archives, and it was given to him. From darkness into light by reading. And there's a statement by Pushkin. We gave it to Gorbachev, and it brought tears to his eyes.
That room should be at the Smithsonian Institution. It's right here at Stanford. On the occasion of his 100th birthday, in December of 2020, the Hoover Institution organized a wonderful multi-day celebration to mark George's 100th birthday and brought together people from the worlds of economics, finance, diplomacy, science, the academic world, to talk about George's contributions to all of those realms. And you can see here some of the distinguished people who appeared that day on Zoom. It's quite an all-star cast. February 6, 2021, that's the day George died. He died peacefully in his bedroom on Dolores Street. On October 8th, 2021, there was a wonderful memorial service for George at Memorial Church here. And it was a gathering where 3 former and 1 incumbent Secretary of State came to deliver eulogies. So you had James Baker, you had Condoleezza Rice, you had Henry Kissinger, and I thought in a wonderful symbol of the bipartisan approach that George took to politics, you had Tony Blinken, the current Secretary of State, come. And Secretary Blinken devoted his remarks to talking about how beloved George was at the State Department. I think, without a doubt, if you go back and look at the Secretaries of State beginning in the post-war period, certainly no one exceeded George Shultz in winning the admiration of the staff at the State Department, and that's because he trusted them. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was wonderful to hear and listen, just absorb it all. Just terrific. And you even mentioned your book, which is a terrific read. I encourage you all to buy it and read it several times. There's many good stories about George Shultz. Let me say it's a real honor for me to be even involved in this ceremony. I've been a long-time friend of George, especially in his last years at Stanford. I learned so much from him. One-on-one conversations at his office, at dinners in the backyard with Obi, where he would put a steak directly on the coals as my good wife Ellen would remind me. It was good. At dinners with Charlotte at their home across the street from where Ellen and I lived, at dinners at our house, Ellen cooked so well. At the Stanford campus, where our offices were right next to each other at the Hoover Institution. And at visits at Villa Cypress, amazing places. And when I served in D.C. and Washington, he came and visited there. It was a thrill. So George has won many awards and acclaims. You heard Phil mention some of these. The one I would begin with is his military service. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Pete Pace, spoke at the American Spirit Award dinner in May 2006, he reminded us of all the things that George did. He guessed that being a Marine was the most cherished job. And he summed it up, and I now quote Pete, "I never regret working for this man directly because it must have been a hoot." Well, George, fortunately for us here, it's still a hoot. After the Marines, George went to MIT. And he stayed there as a professor, except for 1 year, in 1955. He went to Washington. And in Washington, he served on the Council of Economic Advisors. Arthur Burns was the chair. What a job. This is a little quote from the reports that they wrote. George is listed as a member of the staff, and what a staff member he was. I'm still looking for photos of him and Burns at that point. It was really a hoot, so to speak. By the way, I'm wearing a tie that George gave me. It says, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." Remember that. I remembered it. I got to know, George got to know Burns very well over the years. And later, he and Burns were featured on the cover of Time magazine. Here it is. Shultz did not like the wage and price controls, and he fought with Burns about it. Burns wanted it. And there's the headline. The headline was, "Battle of the Economy. Stand pat or do something." George wanted a free market. He was a free market guy way back then. Then in February 23 is another cover, I think, of Time. He was Treasury Secretary. And he saw the advantages of having a more flexible exchange rate. And would it depress the dollar, it'd be good for the economy. And in Time magazine, the cover you can see right now, labeled "The Cheaper Dollar, Impact on Prices and Jobs," he got his way. So there he is. I understand that bust is still available. So much so that when he was later Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, he was again on the cover, this time the New York Times Magazine. Very calm. This is towards the end of his term. You just heard from Phil the amazing things that he accomplished during this period of time. Just an amazing, this is his fourth cabinet post. But much was going behind the scenes. And there's a White House photo here that I found of George flanked by Ronald Reagan and Arthur Burns. And yes, Milton Friedman, you can see Milton Friedman there too. He was a friend back there, a long-term friend of George. So that's an important photo. That's George in action with his friends. And then there were the international conferences. I spent time in government doing international, so I know how important these were. But this is an international conference with George there, with Arthur Burns there, and Paul Volcker was there. So it goes way back. And you can see there, it's not even in English, so it's a different country. Let's not forget that George went to Princeton. And there he is, Princeton man, with his friend Sid Drill. George was class of 42, Sid class of 46, and they still remain friends, good friends. And somehow they got this costume. I don't know how they did it, but there they were. One of the favorite experiences I've had was seeing George speaking at his place in Monterey, Villa Cypress, and then talking informally. Here he is, you can see the cypress trees out the back window. There he would talk about his experiences, talk informally. You could really get into it. It was such a joy to hear the man who had been there and done that, just speaking informally. And so there he was. You could just see the notion using his hands, sitting, relaxing in the chair. It was beautiful. This took place at the so-called Villa Cypress, which you'll see right there is another photo, which is right there. Lynn and I had the opportunity to go many times to be at this place. It's just an amazing location right by the water. Now, one of the tricks that George's wife, Charlotte, did, I'm going to show you next. There it is. Yes, you might think this is a trick. This is the real thing. There's George as a baby. The date of this, of course, is later than that. There's George dressed up as a Princeton tiger, who knows what it was, and there was in the middle the breaking news about George. So I just thought this was a phenomenal picture, phenomenal thing, and I think it's Charlotte's work. But Charlotte did other things with George. This is really one of my favorites. This is the fire department in San Francisco. There they were, making sure the cake didn't blow up or something, I don't know. But this is only his 90th birthday, so it goes back. And there he is having a great time with Charlotte and just enjoying himself with his friends right there. George did other things, of course. Here's a picture, you can barely see it, but this was George giving the so-called lakeside talk at the Bohemian Club. That's George with the view behind him. You can see the crowd. It's whatever he said. Imagine he's there speaking his mind as a former four-position cabinet member. That's the Bohemian encampment. And there's a close-up of the other side, if you can do that. This is the picture of what it looked like as from the other side. You can see the other people on the other side, this lake. So this is why it was called a lakeside talk. And George gave many of them and really gave a close-up view of what it was really like, also not ignoring the current predicaments that we're in. So the next shot is a picture of George, which shows the 4 cabinet posts he had, if you can see that. Labor, Office of Management and Budget, Treasury and State. Plus, let's not forget at the bottom where it says George P. Shultz, Marine, Semper Fidelis. He never forgot that. Very important part of his career. Go to the next one, please. This is from his office. There they are again, Labor, Office of Management and Budget, Treasury and State, plus George Shultz, the Marine. He's there, still there, emphasizing that over in the lower right-hand side. So there's many things that you can think about and remember with good feelings about George. One of them, if I could just switch to the next photo, this is a photo from our house. It represents a few of the things that George gave Lynn and me at various times over our lives when we got to know him very well. There's trophies, there's models. There's a little submarine called the USS Shultz down at the bottom. I don't know where that came from. It made you think about the military as well. So that's an important part of his career, and he just left that with us. We still treasure them so much. So, and then finally, let me get it close to the end here. This is a picture of a book that George and I wrote. George and I are on the cover. I'm very proud of this. Milton Friedman is also on the cover. Milton Friedman, although he had passed already by the time this book was written, we had things in it about him that he'd done. And so part of the essays is there, part of the essays of George. The book is named Choose Economic Freedom, which, don't forget, that's what George was all about. That's the part of George I knew. And he emphasized that. He had to do it in just the right way. So let's not forget that. And finally, this is a symbol that I think is very important. Trust is the coin of the realm. Words to live by. Trust is the coin of the realm. 100th birthday. It's an amazing symbol. And so let's not forget that. And finally, one more photo. We forget that George was an economist. He held many views that made us think about the importance of bringing the world together. That's what he wanted to have happen. So this is a picture of George speaking at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And he spoke wisely, spoke authoritatively, and spoke in a way that motivated us all, whether we're economists or whatever we are, to follow the same strategy that George followed. Thank you.
We're now going to begin a question and answer session. So I would like anybody in the audience to stand up. We have 3 microphones. Please wait until you get a microphone to speak, because this is being recorded. It's online right now. There are people watching it from all over the country. And we will, when you have the microphone, then you can ask your question. And you can ask any question you want about George Shultz or about Phil's book, or maybe the Taylor rule, whatever you wish. So please go ahead. And while we're getting started, while they're coming down, let me just ask a question of both Phil and John. George was always looking ahead, trying to anticipate things. And his very last book was called Hinge of History. And it was, the way it was created was really quite remarkable. And what it did was, I think, was being very foresighted in having us look at what's coming ahead. Would either one of you like to talk about how that book came about and what it said?
I can only talk about the title. It just symbolizes George, the hinge of history. It's such an important thing. Doors open, doors closing, different ways. And I think that's what I think about him most. He was part of the hinge that held history together. And you don't see this very often in people, but you really saw this in him. Whether he was talking about his grandkids, talking about the future, we're talking about America, talking about Russia, he would always have a way to think about the hinges that held us together. So I think that's important. And I'm not sure if that's why he chose that title, where it came from, but it's something I remember.
Yeah. You know, I attended many of the symposia that led to creating the book, and it gave you a sense of George's knack for kind of looking at the big picture and looking ahead. So 2 or 3 years before COVID hit, he did a session one morning or afternoon with leading biomedical researchers at Stanford, and I think UCSF. And the conversation that morning was devoted to the likelihood that there would be a devastating global pandemic. Before that, he would convene meetings to talk about climate change. Having been persuaded by the reality of science that climate change was happening. And so, this was this kind of, ability to, and desire really as much as anything, to kind of look out over the horizon, which I think was true throughout his life. When you go back and look at the Cold War, when he became Secretary of State in 1982, there were very few people in Washington who were thinking about ending the Cold War. It was the height of the Cold War. But George had come to understand the weakness of the Soviet Union and the danger of nuclear war. And so there he is in 1982, starting to try to move U.S. foreign policy towards winding down the Cold War.
Yes. But what so impressed me is that James Timby was a man who had George worked in the State Department, who was an expert he was a PhD from Stanford, actually, in physics, and he was an expert on disarmament, and he was really part of the Iran negotiations and many things. So George hired him out here, and Jim said, what shall I do? And he said, well, whatever you want, what do you think? But I have an idea. said, I think there are a lot of problems coming up in the world in the next 50 years, and maybe we should have some meetings about these and try to get a handle on them. So Jim Simby set up a series of these extraordinary scholarly seminars, and the end of that is compiling a book of all those issues that, if you look at it today, some of it, if you want to see what just the first chapter on demography to show you what the world's going to look like, where the people are going to be living in 50 years, utterly astonishing. So I highly recommend to anybody. Please, question, please.
Hello, I'm Rose Gallimore. I'm the Stephen C. Haase Lecturer at the Hoover Foley Institute, and congratulations on a really good event. I've enjoyed this very much. And thank you for bringing up Jim Timmy. He's one of our great national treasures. But you know, I wanted to ask you, Phil, about that remark that George Shultz made during the clip that you ran, where he pointed at the photo of Reykjavik and said, this is the most important summit ever. This is kind of a softball question, I recognize, and we've already raised the issue of his interest in nuclear disarmament, but I'm interested, he went to a lot of summits. Why was Reykjavik to him the most important one?
Thanks, Rose. Rose, by the way, is a national treasure. Negotiated the New START Treaty, which is now, sadly, seems to be ending because of Putin. So I think, you know, when you go back and look at Reykjavik, which George did with Kissinger and Perry and Nunn and Sid Drell, and I was there actually at Reykjavik covering it for the New York Times. At the time, it seemed to be a terrible disappointment. The talks broke down after 2 days. George held a press conference in which he was very downbeat. He was proud of Reagan for standing tough on SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which George had initially opposed but had come to support. And it was a very downbeat press conference. Gorbachev held a press conference that was more positive. But I think what none of us quite understood at Reykjavik, which became clear later, was that there'd been a number of breakthroughs. The first one was that the leaders, Gorbachev and his foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, and Reagan and Shultz, had talked seriously about eliminating nuclear weapons, period. Secondly, they had laid the groundwork for the first treaty in the Cold War, in the nuclear age, to actually eliminate a whole class of nuclear weapons, intermediate range nuclear weapons, which was negotiated and signed a few years later. There was a breakthrough at Reykjavik in the middle of the night. The delegations from both sides worked overnight in this small house by the sea, and one of the baskets of things they were negotiating over was really remarkable given what had preceded it, which was a discussion of human rights in the Soviet Union and the abuses of human rights there. And until Gorbachev took office, the line in the Kremlin was that we don't talk about that. That's our domestic sovereign issue. You have no right to bring it up. That night in Reykjavik, they spent the night talking about that in a breakthrough way. And so what looked at the time to have been a kind of failure actually turned out to be a pivot point in the Cold War that led really over the next couple of years to the winding down of the Cold War, to the point when Reagan left office in January of '89. It was all but over.
George Shultz spent over 30 years at the Hoover Institution. John, could you tell us about his impact on the institution over those years?
It's a very, very important question. His office was, as I mentioned in my remarks, right next to mine, so I saw a lot of him. And we talked a lot about things, broadly speaking. He was an economist, I am an economist. So he talked about the economic side of so much of foreign policy, which unfortunately gets put aside these days. I think that was an impact he had. He brought these different ways of thinking, economic ways of thinking, into the discussion with politics and diplomacy, which he knew very well, knew both very well, and a lot of experience with it. But I think that's an input that he had. It's affected the Hoover Institution, it's affected Stanford more generally. I mentioned in my last slide, he was also very active at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research way back when. I was a director at one point. And that's another example. So it's throughout. I think we need more of that, quite frankly. I think if he were here, he would be doing more of that. And that's a legacy that we should emphasize more of. Not just Stanford, not just Hoover, but more generally. I think that's the kind of thing he would be advocating.
Thank you so much for all of this important and interesting information about George Shultz. I have a question about him, however, that does arise from deep, deep respect, but might seem pretty challenging. And here it is. Many of us believe that between 2016 and early 2021, American democracy underwent the greatest challenge domestically that it's had. And to be honest, I expected someone like George Shultz to say something about the better nature of America as it's been said. And I'm not aware that he did. Somehow it didn't reach my ears. That he said something about the best impulses of his party, the leaders he had worked with, and a vision of America. I'm especially impelled to ask this question because on his birthday emblem, according to what you've pictured, it said, "Trust is the coin of the realm." And I don't see how anyone could believe that trust did not undergo its greatest challenge in American history during that period. So just what I would like to know is it unfair of me to expect that George would have said something that helped lift the public discourse?
Thank you. John?
I like these easy questions. So I think the thing you're looking for is things that George would say a lot, maybe not with big microphone and big audiences, but he was very concerned about the way things were going. I don't know a specific episode, but in talking with him about politics and about economics, et cetera, I would notice that. It maybe just be small dinner parties, maybe conversation in his house, maybe a conversation in his office, but it was no change. I didn't see the change that you're observing. So maybe externally, he was becoming quite old at that point, of course. It may be part of that, but I didn't notice anything along the lines you're talking about. So and again, maybe I'm looking for, again, I'm sorry to keep mentioning economics, but we talked a lot about economics. And I think he was hoping that would form a degree of trust. And trust is the coin of the realm, or maybe the economic philosophy. We need more of that, quite frankly, I think. We're seeing it, the Soviet Union and Ukraine, and there's still struggles about which way the United States is going and other places are going. But I think that's an element that he would have lasted, he would have continued to talk about.
So I think, he was muted, and he was quite disparaging about Trump in his private conversations. On the eve of the 2016 election, the Friday of Labor Day weekend that fall, he issued a statement with Henry Kissinger. And you might feel the timing was designed to get the least possible press coverage. It's well known in the media world that if you announce something on the Friday of Labor Day weekend, it's likely to disappear into a black hole. And the statement said, here are two Republican former secretaries of state, that we do not plan to vote for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. So it was a kind of slap in the face at Trump, and that however we are available to provide advice to whomever is elected. And then he gave something that was not very publicly visible. I happened to be there at the time. He spoke at a lunch at the Olympic Club in San Francisco. We're now a year or two into the Trump presidency. And a question came up about immigration. And George pulled out of his jacket pocket the text of a speech that Ronald Reagan had given, a memorable speech. I urge you all to go back and look at it. It is one of the most articulate and eloquent defenses of immigration and the importance that immigrants have played in American history. George read that out loud at the Olympic Club, and that was very clearly a slap at Donald Trump.
I have a question for Phil, and that is, when George Shultz asked you if you wanted to write his book, did you expect him to do so? And then how did you react, and how did you want, in other words, you're a journalist, you know George, you've been around him a long time. How could you make sure that you could be objective about things and write a biography that you wanted to write?
So the moment when George Shultz asked me if I would be interested in writing his biography was a classic kind of Stanford moment, okay? It's at the lunch before big game. And it's a lunch that's held every 2 years here. I think it's lapsed in recent years, which is too bad. But whenever the game was at Stanford, the Stanford president and chairman of the Stanford Board of Trustees would host a lunch, and they would invite the president of the University of California, Berkeley, and his or her top aides. And so he pulls me aside at this lunch. I'm already working on a book in which he's a main character about nuclear weapons. And he said, would you be interested in writing my biography? I was startled. And so, he was very patient because I said, look, I've got to finish this book first. I can't really give you an answer. But as an incentive, beyond the honor of him asking me, he said, I'll give you exclusive access to my archives at the Hoover Institution. He's got a vast archive here, 2,000 at least, boxes of papers. It's enormous. And I went to look to see what was in there while I was trying to figure out whether I wanted to do this biography. And lo and behold, there is one of the great Cold War documents that no one had seen except George Shultz and the man who wrote it. It is an 800-page, single-space typed diary that was kept through the first 2.5 years of his tenure as Secretary of State by his executive assistant. It's a blow-by-blow account of all the infighting in the Reagan administration. It's an extraordinary document. It's open, I believe, now for scholars and others to look at. So this sealed the deal for me. I mean, my gosh, this is a unique historical resource for somebody writing a biography. So I finally, after I finished the other book, I said, George, I'd love to do this book. I'm honored that you would ask me, but we got to have an understanding about it. I said, it's your life, but it's my book. And I cannot surrender my editorial independence. If you want a book that you control the content of, I understand that. I'm not the person to write that book. I won't be hurt if you ask somebody else to do it. He agreed instantly. That was a deal he liked. And I'll tell you, to the day he died, and he saw a lot of the book in his last few years as I was drafting it, he never asked me to change anything to make him look more favorable.
Phil, did you show her any of the chapters about the conflicts in the Reagan administration?
Sure.
That he doesn't come out well in all of them.
You know, there are. It is not a hagiography. There's some very tough chapters in this book about him, his involvement in Watergate and a kind of ancillary part of Watergate where he allowed the IRS under his command as Treasury Secretary in the Nixon administration to conduct a really unjustified tax investigation of Larry O'Brien, the recent chair of the Democratic National Committee. There's a chapter in the book about his involvement in Iran-Contra. It's not quite the story that George liked to tell about his role in Iran-Contra. So there's chapters in there that I think would have been very difficult for him. But, you know, as I said, you know, you want an independent journalist to do the book, you got to live with the consequences.
Norm.
So, is this on?
Yes.
This is fascinating, and my question may be an example of sort of going from the sublime to the ridiculous, but because part of the focus is on George Shultz and his connection to Stanford, I'm curious if you, either of you or both of you, have any comments or observations on George Shultz's connection to the whole Theranos incident. And as I say, his house on campus was involved and there was family. So I'd just be interested in hearing what, if anything, you have to say about that.
Sure.
You go first.
Okay. So let me start by telling you a little anecdote. At the point at which the book was coming into shape, I went to my literary agent in New York, who's a very significant figure in the publishing world. And she took me out to a very nice restaurant, and I said, I think I'm ready to have you try to sell this book to a publisher. She looked at me, she doesn't mince words. She said, Phil, I can't sell this book right now. And I said, why is that? And she said, because the only thing anyone in New York wants to know about George Shultz is Theranos. And it was true. So I'm glad you asked the question. It's in the book. I had to deal with it. It's in the beginning and the end of the book. The short story to me is, he thought the technology was transformative. It goes to his desire to look over the horizon. He thought it was going to be a game changer. Elizabeth Holmes asked him to form a board of directors for her, which he did, a very esteemed group of people, none of whom knew anything about biomedical issues. She gave him 2,500 shares of Theranos stock. He bought another 500 shares. At peak value, as stories were beginning to just come out about fraud, that stock was worth $50 million. And last but not least, I think that he was infatuated with Elizabeth Holmes. Not in a sexual way. I mean, the gap in years was like 70 years. But, you know, he was drawn to her. I think she sort of bewitched him. And when you put all of that together, you get a misjudgment, not to mention his advanced age at the time. It's too bad because it was a kind of heartbreaking coda at the end of his life, especially his handling of his grandson when Tyler came to him asking for help, and he stood by Elizabeth Holmes.
One of the things that is remarkable, if you just try to look at the history books, papers, it occurs all the time. It stands out, and I think that's something that we'll get used to, get over, because you know we knew her at dinner parties, et cetera. It was a different. I don't really kind of agree with Phil at this point, but it was just the way it was. It was not really as big a deal as you think it is, based on your question or based on many of your thoughts.
Hi.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know George Shultz, but I met him on one memorable occasion. I was friendly with George McGovern and Larry O'Brien, but I had the privilege of traveling with George by chance. It was in the mid-90s. I boarded a Delta Airlines L-1011 from Atlanta. I was medical faculty here at Stanford. And there's nobody on the plane, and I get in, and I hand the hostess my jacket. And she goes to put it in the closet, and she sees a red jacket. And she looks at me, and she says, "Is that your jacket?" I said, "No, it's not." There was nobody else on the plane but one person sitting in the seat next to me. And she said, "Well, is it that man's jacket?" And I said, "Well, it could well be." So I sit down, and she comes over to the gentleman next to me, and she says, "Did you put a red jacket in the closet?" And he said, "What red jacket?" The very red jacket you saw up there, and it was George Shultz. So he was upbraided by the Delta Airlines hostess for having the audacity to put his own red jacket in the closet without her permission. So I said to her, "You should probably be careful. That man is the former Secretary of State of the United States." So she said, "Well, I don't care who he is. He can't put his red jacket in my closet without my permission." So we traveled together, and we had a very nice conversation. And the topic of the Reagan years came up and the disputes. And he was reading a book, and it was Tom Clancy's Clear and Present Danger. So I said, "Well, tell me, Mr. Shultz, was it really like that in the Reagan cabinet?" And he said, "Absolutely. The disputes were horrendous, and we argued about all sorts of things." So at that point, if you recall, the left was losing its mind over Ronald Reagan. So George Shultz had some very interesting anecdotes, but I thought I'd just tell you that as a character for what he was like. He had a natural sense of humor, and when circumstances presented them, he was quite humble. He didn't complain to Delta Airlines that they'd upbraided him. So a very humorous man with a insightful knowledge.
Thank you. I have now 3 questions that were submitted by online watchers before the program began. And let me try this first one out on you. Did George anticipate how difficult it would be for Russia and the former Soviet bloc to transform their economy? What did he envision as Russia's role in the world with the dismantling of the Soviet bloc? What did he believe the U.S. could do to encourage Russia to transform itself into a better actor on the global stage? That's quite a lot, but one of you want to try it?
So is there a thread of similarity here that I think is, it may be because of my conversations with George. And I would say he'd be looking for connectivity. He'd be looking for relationships that we don't notice that much. And I think that's what drove him a lot. I wish we had more of that these days. But that was, I think, the similarity that I would stress in trying to answer all those questions. Is there a way that you could relate to things that are concerned to all of us, concerned to everybody in the world, that bring these countries together?
Here's another one. Did George Shultz accomplish everything he planned or wanted to do? Did he have anything left in his plans he didn't get to, or did he have any regrets? Well, that's a hard one, but...
You know, his life was so full of accomplishment. You know, the amazing thing was that he just kept moving ahead with these gatherings that he would organize. And you know, the Hinge of History, or is that the title?
Yes.
That was the last of the books. But I believe had he lived another 5 years and had retained his cognitive acuity and energy, there would have been further examinations of pressing national and international issues. So it's hard to answer that question in a definitive way, but I'm pretty sure that he had this kind of hunger to try to be helpful. The title of the book is In the Nation's Service, which some of you may remember is also the Princeton motto. And he truly believed that his life should be devoted to serving the nation and the world.
And the final online question is this: how can diplomacy adapt to the fast-moving and often competing narratives in social media? Diplomacy moves at glacial speed compared to social media information and misinformation. I'm sure George himself would have something to say about that. But what do you think it would be? What George might think?
You know, the observation I would make is there's something to be said for the stately nature of diplomacy in an earlier era. And by that I mean the opportunity to reflect, not to rush to judgment. And this was something that I think George was exceedingly good at, was not rushing to judgment. It was reading into history, asking his aides to give him the contrary arguments for policy issues, and then taking his time to sort through them. And I think, you know, the lightning pace of the world today makes diplomacy in a kind of creative way that George practiced it harder to practice.
It's a question over there.
Can I add something? Sorry.
Oh, yes,
Well,
please. No, please, John, I'm sorry.
I won't.
Go, John, please go ahead.
So I think one thing, there's a positive element of that. The communications are improving. I mean, it's becoming all sorts of crazy communications, but I think I view that as by blogs and all sorts of things we do. I mean, you mentioned the Taylor rules. Everybody knows about the Taylor rules. Why? Because it's all over the place. So whether it's good or bad, it's there. And I think that's an example. The knowledge is spreading so rapidly, it's hard to fathom. I think I would view it as a positive element.
As an energy person, we haven't talked much about his passion and his journey to energy and climate, and especially the Montreal Protocol, which I would think, from a global standpoint, ranks right up there among his accomplishments. I was able to do a taped interview with Secretary Shultz 4 years ago in his private conference room, and he talked about the analogy of how he convinced a very skeptical President Reagan to adopt the Montreal Protocol, essentially what he called an insurance policy. If that was one of his highly ranked accomplishments, we certainly haven't made that kind of progress in climate, which he wanted to apply that same analogy of the Montreal Protocol. I would be interested in conversations you may have had with him about this topic and how that banner gets carried on.
Did you and George talk about that?
Not much.
So, you know, the analogy, just to fill out what you were saying, is Reagan was not particularly interested in this issue of the ozone layer. And George persuaded him with the analogy of an insurance policy. Basically, he said to the president, you know, look, we have insurance policies in the possibility that something bad can happen in so many fields. Think of it that way. That's what we need to deal with the erosion of the ozone layer. And Reagan bought the idea, and that's what led to the American involvement and support for those protocols. So it was an interesting case of Reagan, you know, turning to Shultz for something that was kind of not typical foreign policy, national security, and listening to what George told him.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Nandini Tandon, and I'm a venture capitalist in the life sciences arena. I'm much looking forward to reading your book, Dr. Talk. I just wanted to share that I was very fortunate to have multiple occasions to be with Secretary Shultz one-on-one, ranging on topics from women leadership, innovation, science, Quad, and also Martin Luther King and Gandhi's influence on the global plane on diplomacy from a soft power angle. When I walked away from each and every meeting of mine with him, that he made me feel very much at par with him. And at no juncture did I feel that although I was a double minority, a woman, and of Indian origin, that he would in any way or shape interface with me in a manner that made me feel uncomfortable. On the contrary, I felt that he took deep interest.
Yes. Do you have a question?
So my question to you is, did you see that in him at the age of 99? He was thirsty for innovation, thirsty for next generation, thirsty for looking at leadership, evolving. Did you see his support of women? I know he used to speak very warmly of Charlotte because I was on a board with her. Did you see his support of women leadership? And I would be very curious to hear your point of view. Thank you.
No, indeed. You know, George was inclusive before the word inclusive became so common as it is today. He had a great ability to demonstrate in very kind of nuanced ways his respect for the people that he was meeting with. I think that's the basis of the trust that he built with so many people, that he radiated a sense of interest in what they were saying, respect for what they had to say, regardless of gender, ethnicity, et cetera. And the example that I give, it happens to have been with another white man, but it captures to me a lot of George, was when he went to meet with Reagan in the Oval Office with an ambassador at the State Department named Jim Goodby. And Jim was an arms control negotiator for the United States during the Reagan administration. And, when you go into the Oval Office, there's a certain decorum that the president sits in a wingback chair. The wingback chair next to the president is reserved for the senior visiting figure. And then the lesser ranking people sit on the sofas on either side of the coffee table. And so they walk into the Oval Office, and of course everyone expected George Shultz to sit in the wingback chair next to Ronald Reagan. And he said, no, Jim Goodby, you sit there. Jim Goodby is in his mid-90s now. He remembers that moment to this day. It was the ultimate sign of respect from George Shultz. And that's the way George treated people.
I've got some announcements, but first, how about some applause for our president? Now, first of all, the Stanford Historical Society exists for the sole purpose of putting on programs about Stanford history and for publishing materials and books about Stanford history. We have some very interesting books coming out in the future. But we would like everyone who cares about Stanford history to join us. We could use new members. We put on 6 or 8 programs like this a year. If you join us, then you will be getting an email notification of all of our meetings, and all of our meetings are now online and in person. Not all, but most of them are. So I hope you will join us. We would love to have you. You can go to our website, just go up to Google and say Stanford Historical Society, and you can find out information. I hope you will join us. Now I also want to talk a little bit about books. These 2 books will do. There are 2 books here. Choose Freedom, Economic Freedom is a book, of course, that John talked about, that he and George wrote together. It's not for sale, but John did have a few copies, and they're outside in the reception area for anyone who would like to take a copy until they run out. Now, the other book we have many copies of for sale, and that is Philip Taubman's book. Now, I have read every syllable of Phil's book. books. I've read all 3 of Phil's books. They're all excellent. But this is a particularly interesting book because it's almost like a thriller as you read about the intrigue between the CIA and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, who's supposed to be in charge of foreign policy. And it's a riveting story. And so I would really, for just that reason alone, but it's a terrific book. It's got excellent reviews from the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and anybody who's read it. So Phil will be out there signing them, and I hope you will do that. Take a look at it. Now, one last thing. There's a special treat. George Shultz will be remembered a long time because of what we're about to see. This is the new George Shultz building. Now, this is the backside view, but it's an enormous building that has lots of facilities that goes here in the Hoover Institution. And if you look at the other view, you will see that is the iconic view. To the left is Encina Hall, then there's the Shultz building, and then a Hoover Tower. I expect to see this photograph as an iconic photograph for Stanford and certainly the Hoover Institution for a long time. That Shultz building has been under construction for quite a while. It will be dedicated in February of next year, and they will move into it shortly thereafter. But I think it's wonderful that we, at this program, were able to see this early picture of the finished building. So thank you all. Now, the best news of all, we have a wonderful reception outside. So please go and have some drink, some eats, get a book from John Taylor and one from Phil and have it signed. Thank you very much.